In the winter of 2021, every scrapyard, auction yard, and machinery row in Cedar County, Missouri, was telling the same story about old iron. Steel prices had jumped, yards were paying better than they had in years, and farmsteads all across the county began cleaning themselves in the name of efficiency. The story people told was practical enough to pass without challenge. Old cultivator frames were not assets. Bent wagon gears were not assets. Rusted corn head snouts, cracked auger tubes, broken draper supports, ruined feed bunks, dead field cultivators, twisted chisel plow shanks, obsolete grain drills, worn loader brackets, and every other forgotten piece of steel leaning against machine sheds or lying behind tree lines had become clutter at best and accusation at worst. Modern farms did not need piles of scrap. Modern farms needed room, cash, and clean yards that looked as if every decision in them had been made recently and with purpose. So men sold their scrap iron for pennies on the pound and congratulated one another on finally getting rid of junk. One of the few men in the county who did not join them was Lester Bain. Lester was 62 that winter, a soybean, corn, and hay farmer south of Stockton with enough welding burns on his forearms to look permanently stippled in summer light. He was broad through the chest, bent slightly at one shoulder from an old loader accident, and carried himself with the calm irritability of men who have spent 30 years hearing younger people confuse tidiness with preparedness. His farm was not pretty in the dealership sense. It was working. Tools were where they should be. Chains hung in order. Hoses were coiled, mostly. The machine shed floor had oil stains old enough to count as history. And behind the main shop, arranged in rows that offended local minimalists, stood Lester's scrap iron. He did not call it scrap. He called it stock. There were old toolbar sections stacked by wall thickness. Wagon tongues. Auger flighting lengths. Angle iron from long-dead corral panels. Heavy plate cut from a silage box chassis 20 years earlier. Short channel sections tagged in paint marker with their dimensions. Round shafting. Square tubing. Snouts from obsolete corn heads with salvageable skins. Grain tank patches. Sheet steel from combined side panels. Even rusted drawbars he had cut free from machines nobody remembered because the steel in them was honest and thick and getting harder to buy quickly when a season went bad. To local people, it looked like a yard full of abandoned decisions. To Lester, it looked like a warehouse without a sales counter. His son Bo hated explaining it to visitors. Bo was 31, smart, hardworking, and raised in that awkward period between analog necessity and modern abundance. He could weld well enough, run monitors, program rate controllers, and talk to the seed rep without sounding impressed. He respected his father, but he also believed the farm carried more history than it needed. When scrap prices jumped in 2021, Bo pushed hard. "We've got 30,000 pounds of rusty maybe back there," he told Lester one January evening. "That's not inventory. That's a tetanus hedge." Lester was scraping mud from a loader bucket edge with a putty knife. "That's steel. It's steel we haven't used in years." Lester looked up once. "That because the years haven't asked right." Bo laughed because that sounded like one of the old man's sermons disguised as farm talk. "You say stuff like that and then wonder why people think you belong in 1984. Lester shrugged. 1984 had better steel. Now, that answer would have been just another bit of generational friction if the county had not so strongly lined up on the other side. Scrap trucks moved through Cedar County all winter and into early spring. Men hauled out old drills they had once kept for parts, worn feeder house floors, snapped mower bars, frame rails, truck beds, dead gravity boxes, and piles of angle and channel left from forgotten modifications. The scrap yard in El Dorado Springs got so busy on certain Saturdays the scale line backed up into the road. Clean yards became a point of pride. A neighbor named Kurt Willoughby sold 2 old field cultivators, 3 wagon gears, and a row of steel he had inherited from his father, then told anybody who asked that it felt like finally clearing dead money. Another farmer, Tyler Meeks, posted a photo of his emptied back lot online and captioned it with something about a farm breathing easier without junk leaning on every fence. Lester heard all of that and sold almost nothing. A few truly useless bits went. Rotten thin skins, twisted stuff beyond honest recovery, old corrugated metal with more holes than purpose. But the heavy, useful pieces stayed. Bo argued. Lester refused. By March the issue had gone from disagreement to background weather. It sat under every conversation about room in the shop, every discussion of ordering new steel for a repair, every joke at the co-op about the Bain place looking like a short-line manufacturer with a hoarding problem. Lester did not defend himself much. He had learned years earlier that men who want clean explanations are usually not asking to understand. They are asking to hear themselves confirmed. The season turned mean in a way no one had planned for. Spring rains came heavily, then quit suddenly. Planting started late on some tracts, hurried on others, and left enough ruts and rushed decisions in the county that summer already carried the smell of improvisation before June had earned it. Then came the windstorm in late June, one of those hard, violent Midwestern systems that hit machine sheds sideways, tore at grain bin ladders, rolled old sheet metal, and rattled every piece of equipment not pinned down with reason or luck. Cedar County did not take the full brunt that a few neighboring counties took, but it caught enough to damage things people would need later and not remember until exactly the wrong moment. An auger tube here. A wagon side there. A bent support on a grain cart. Twisted corn head snouts on machines parked badly. The county patched what it could and told itself harvest was still far enough off to sort the rest. Then July burned. Soybeans held for a while. Corn started talking back in the lighter ground. Hay was short in the second cutting. The county's mechanical confidence, already bruised by spring and storm, shifted into triage. Farmers repaired what they could from dealer stock and catalog steel. Supply seemed annoying but manageable. Nobody yet understood how many of the season's later failures would not need complex parts. They would need simple steel. Heavy, local, odd-sized, immediately available steel in the exact shape the county had just sold off by the ton. The first serious lesson came with Kurt Willoughby's grain cart in early September. Kurt had sold half the old iron on his place that winter and bragged about it often enough that the county remembered. During corn prep, a support cradle under the grain cart auger cracked through at the heat-affected zone of an old factory weld. Not uncommon. Not catastrophic if fixed quickly. But the repair required a piece of heavy wall channel and a reinforcement plate thick enough to keep the cradle from flexing under full auger load. The dealer had a replacement brace kit on backorder. The local steel yard in Nevada was cleaned out of the exact channel size after storm season demand and a run of construction orders. Kurt spent 2 days calling around for short drops and came up with either the wrong thickness, the wrong profile, or steel so expensive and so far away it would arrive after the first weather risk mattered. Bo heard about the problem over coffee and came home irritated because he knew exactly what his father would say. Lester said it anyway. "We've got 3 pieces behind the shop." Kurt drove over that afternoon, looked at the row of stacked stock behind Lester's shed, and went quiet in the unpleasant way men do when a joke they told in February is standing in front of them as solution in September. Lester did not drag out the moment. He walked past round stock, past angle, past an old toolbar frame, and stopped at a length of heavy channel cut from a manure spreader rebuild 15 years earlier. It was almost exact. He laid it on sawhorses, measured, then pulled a plate section from an old forage wagon subframe that matched thickness better than any new piece Kurt had priced. Kurt turned the channel over in his hands and said, "You kept this for 15 years?" Lester answered, "No. I kept it for today." That line moved through the county before the grain cart repair had cooled. The repair itself took one evening. Lester and Bo cut, fitted, gusseted, drilled, and braced the cart cradle in a way stronger than factory, uglier than factory, and far more immediate than anything Kurt could have bought. The cart went back to work before his beans were ready enough to punish delay. Kurt paid for the steel and the work, but more than that, he carried away the beginning of a county correction. The next week Tyler Meeks lost the floor under the feeder house throat on his older combine. It did not fail all at once. Rust never does. It just finally admitted what years of dust, moisture, vibration, and postponement had been negotiating toward. The sheet under the feeder chain let go in a place that could not be ignored, and suddenly Tyler needed not a complex factory part but a curved floor section of hard enough steel to take abrasion and thin enough to shape in a day. The dealer could order a formed replacement. Maybe. Shipping uncertain. The local machine shop was backed up. Tyler had sold a whole pile of old combine panels and sheet sections that winter because, in his words then, "I'm not running a museum for rusty skins." Now he was. Only the museum was Lester's. Lester walked Tyler through the stock line and pulled 2 side skins off a long-dead Gleaner tank extension and 1 lower feeder panel from a scrap machine bought for tires a decade earlier. The skins alone were wrong. The feeder panel alone was too pitted. Together, cut smart and stitched to a heavier wear strip from an obsolete chopper hood, they became exactly what Tyler needed: a serviceable feeder house floor that took a day to fabricate and would almost certainly outlast the combine itself if greased and watched honestly. Tyler stood there while Bo and Lester built it and finally said, "I sold this exact kind of stuff for 12 cents a pound in March." Lester, fitting the wear strip with a clamp, said, "Most people do right before the season tells them what steel used to mean." Now, a single county can absorb 2 cautionary examples and still pretend they are anecdotes. What turns anecdotes into policy is repetition. And repetition came hard that fall. A dryer fan housing cracked at the flange on a farm north of Kaplinger Mills. Lester cut the replacement ring from a section of old truck frame crossmember and skinned it with plate from a dead gravity box support nobody else would have trusted because they had forgotten how to judge thickness by eye. A cornhead snout bracket folded on Bo's own machine when they found a hidden rock the county road crew had rolled into the field edge months earlier. The factory bracket was unavailable. Lester used a short length of square tubing from an abandoned hay merger tongue, skinned it with snout steel from an obsolete 6-row head, and had the row back together by dusk. A grain auger elbow wore through on another farm, and Lester solved it with salvaged curved stock from an old cyclone separator body that had been leaning behind the barn so long Bo had stopped seeing it. Every one of those repairs carried the same lesson in a different shape. The county had mistaken locally stored material for embarrassment. Then the season turned material into time, and time into yield, and suddenly the difference between clutter and preparedness looked thinner than anybody liked. Bo changed faster than the county did. At first he changed because he had to. He was working beside the evidence. He saw how quickly a stack of ugly old channel could become a grain cart back in service. He saw how a bent snout or split housing support, when met with the right stock, was merely an evening problem instead of a 3-day catastrophe. He saw his father select steel by sound, by weight, by how a flame cut traveled through it, by memory of which dead machine it had once belonged to and what abuse it had survived before becoming available for something else. That last part mattered. Lester did not just keep iron. He remembered its biography. A plate from a forage wagon frame had a different toughness than light guard tin off an auger. Old toolbar tube carried load differently than decorative angle from a feeder rack. Steel was not generic to him. It had history, and history meant engineering if a man paid attention. One afternoon in October, after they had repaired a cracked wagon tongue for a neighbor and reinforced their own grain cart ladder mount for winter hauling, Bo stood at the edge of the stock rows and said, almost to himself, "I thought this was all just because you hated throwing stuff away." Lester was marking one end of a channel with soapstone. He did not look up. "No," he said. "That's your generation story about men who don't like being helpless." Bo let that sit a while. Then he asked, "How do you know what to keep?" Lester finally looked at him. You keep shape, thickness, and honesty. Rust you can clean. Thin you can't fix. Bent depends on wear. Fancy's useless. Common sizes lie to you. Odd pieces save seasons. That became, more or less, the operating philosophy of the Bain place after 2021. The county changed more slowly and more reluctantly, because counties hate admitting they sold wisdom for pennies. But change came. The scrap runs slowed. Men began asking harder questions before hauling old implements away. Was the frame straight? Was the channel honest? Did that dead feed wagon still hold heavy plate? Were those mower conditioner tongues maybe worth cutting loose before the machine went over the scale? At the co-op, the jokes about Lester's junkyard dried up. In their place came requests. One man wanted to know whether Lester would look at a bent ripper hitch. Another asked if he had any short 3/8 plate for a bin door repair. A third, who had spent the spring posting pictures of his cleaned-up yard like a man documenting spiritual progress, asked quietly whether Lester thought an old cultivator frame should maybe stay home rather than go to the scrap line. Lester never gloated. That is one of the reasons the lesson stuck. He did not stand in the county's embarrassment waving a cutting torch like a sermon. He simply kept using the iron. He charged fairly. Sometimes too fairly, according to Bo. He let the season say what it needed to say. The biggest moment came in late October, right as the weather started threatening the kind of wet cold that can turn a manageable harvest into a county-wide mutiny. Their own combine developed a crack in the unloading auger support bracket where years of vibration and one too many loaded swings had finally found weak metal. The bracket was not a glamorous failure. No one would tell stories about it if it had happened in June. But in late October, with beans still standing and rain 3 days out, it became the sort of failure that divides finished harvest from regret. The proper replacement was unavailable. The dealer's only likely option was freight from Illinois with no promise before Monday. Monday would be too late. Bo saw his father look once at the broken bracket, then turn toward the stock rows without drama. They walked behind the shed in the dusk. Lester stopped at a stack Bo had always considered too random to matter: old elevator braces, combined clean-out doors, wagon runners, a bent axle support, and one thick gusseted arm off a junked mixer wagon. Lester pulled the mixer arm free, knocked scale off it with a hammer, then held it up against the broken auger support. Perfect was not the word. Right was. The gusset geometry matched the load direction better than the original factory bracket had. The thickness was greater. The only real work involved trimming and drilling. They cut it, fitted it, sleeved one pivot point with a section of salvaged shaft collar, and braced the backside with a plate cut from an old ripper standard mount. The auger went back on before full dark. The combine ran the next morning, and the next day, and through the weather window that closed 42 hours later. The Bains finished their soybeans before the rain. Several neighbors did not. That repair settled the whole year inside Bo more deeply than the earlier jobs had. Those earlier repairs had helped neighbors. This one finished their own season. There is a difference. A farm can admire a principle while it helps other people. It only truly believes when the principle carries its own harvest to safety. After they finished, Bo walked behind the shed with a legal pad and began listing the stock rows by type. Lester watched from the shop doorway and said nothing for a while. Finally he asked, "What are you doing?" Bo answered without looking up. "Trying to stop calling it scrap." That may have been the highest compliment his father ever received from him. Winter turned the county philosophical. When the machinery meeting started and the coffee shops filled with post-harvest certainty, men who had sold off their iron too aggressively began telling the story a little differently than they had lived it. They said scrap prices had been tempting. They said nobody could have known material would get tight in exactly those ways. They said modern repairs should not require a salvage yard behind the shop. All true enough to protect pride. But in the middle of those conversations was a harder truth. One man south of Stockton had finished the season largely because his version of clutter included steel that still knew how to work. The local extension agent even invited Lester to speak at a winter workshop on low-cost repair and salvage strategy. Lester declined because he distrusted rooms where men took notes on what common sense could teach better with mud on boots. Bo went instead and, to his own surprise, told the story himself. Not as a morality play. Not as anti-modern nonsense. Just as a farm lesson. He told them that scrap iron is not all equal. He told them to keep heavy channel, thick plate, honest tubing, shaped pieces with real load history, and curved stock that would be miserable to source in a hurry. He told them to stop judging material by yard appearance alone. He told them that steel kept locally is sometimes a form of harvest insurance. And when somebody laughed and said that sounded like his father talking, Bo answered, "Yeah. It does now." That answer made the room quieter than the extension agent expected. Years later, men in Cedar County still told the story by starting with the scrap run. The winter prices. The cleaned-up yards. The pride of empty back rows. Then they told how the season turned, how brackets cracked and floors rusted through and wagons failed and augers needed steel that catalogs could not deliver fast enough. They told how Lester Bain kept his iron. How he cut it, shaped it, welded it, gusseted it, and returned broken machines to work while other men waited for freight and weather did not wait for them. Some called him stubborn. Some called him old school. A few even called him smart in public, which is rarer in rural counties than outsiders imagine. But everyone remembered the same final fact. They sold their scrap iron for pennies. Then one man used his to finish the season. And after that, a lot fewer farms in Cedar County were so eager to call useful steel junk just because it had already lived once.